Something big is brewing, and it could mark the end of America's dominance on the world stage. Donald Trump is considering pulling the United States out of the IMF, the World Bank, and even NATO. If he follows through, it could change everything. The global order we've known for decades would shift, and China could rise as the new superpower. Will Trump really go through with it? And what does it mean for the rest of the world? In this video, we break it all down, so make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming next. When Donald Trump first introduced the slogan, "Make America Great Again," many saw it as a promise to boost the U.S. economy. But the message went far beyond domestic prosperity. It marked a major shift in America's role on the global stage. At the heart of this shift was the America First doctrine, a policy that pulled the U.S. away from international cooperation and toward isolation. Under this approach, the U.S. withdrew from key global organizations and treaties, stepping back from its leadership role. This created space for rival powers to rise. For example, China has grown bolder in the Pacific, conducting live-fire naval drills in the Tasman Sea. With the U.S. pulling back, allies like Australia and New Zealand now face a new reality, one where America's military presence can no longer be taken for granted. Economically, the effects are just as significant. Asian nations that once depended on U.S. trade are now diversifying. The growing America Plus One strategy signals a move toward a multipolar world, with China and India stepping up as major players. Still, replacing the U.S. remains difficult, given the size and strength of its economy. Domestically, the influence of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 cannot be overstated. This comprehensive blueprint aims to radically restructure the federal government, aligning it more closely with conservative ideologies. One major change: slashing the Department of Education staff from 4,000 to 2,000 employees. It's a step toward reducing federal oversight and giving more control to local authorities, a long-standing conservative goal. Further worsening the concerns is the dismissal of inspectors general across various federal agencies and the armed forces. These officials play a crucial role in maintaining ethical standards and accountability within the government. Their removal has sparked fears of unchecked executive power and the erosion of institutional checks and balances. The alignment between the current administration's actions and the objectives outlined in Project 2025 is striking. Paul Dans, the project's former director, has expressed astonishment at the rapid implementation of measures he once only envisioned. This alignment underscores a deliberate strategy to reshape the federal landscape fundamentally. Internationally, the America First doctrine has precipitated a notable shift in U.S. foreign policy. Traditionally, the Republican Party maintained a staunchly anti-Russian stance, rooted in Cold War dynamics. However, under Trump's leadership, there has been an obvious shift towards a more friendly approach to Russia, reflecting shared nationalist and traditionalist values. This realignment has profound implications for global power structures and America's role within them. Critics argue that this inward turn diminishes America's ability to influence global affairs, ceding ground to other powers and undermining the very notion of American exceptionalism. The retreat from multilateral engagements and the erosion of democratic norms domestically have raised alarms about the future trajectory of U.S. leadership on the world stage. From the moment Donald Trump returned to the White House in 2025, he wasted no time proving that his America First policy was serious. He signed several orders that pulled the U.S. out of important international agreements and organizations. These actions shocked many because they reduced America's influence in the world. On his first day back in office, January 20th, 2025, Trump signed an order to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Again. He had already done this once before, during his first term, but the Biden administration had rejoined. Trump called the agreement unfair and said it hurt American businesses while letting countries like China pollute freely. By leaving, the U.S. stood alone, along with only a few other nations that refused to take part in global efforts to fight climate change. When the U.S. first joined the Paris Agreement, it promised to cut pollution by 26 to 28% by 2025. It also agreed to give $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund, GCF, which helps poorer countries deal with climate change. By 2017, the US had already sent $1 billion to the fund. This money helped developing nations switch to cleaner energy instead of relying on coal and oil. Because the US is such a powerful country, other nations took climate change more seriously when it was involved. Its leadership pushed big polluters like China and India to make their own promises. But with Trump withdrawing from the agreement, that leadership is now gone. China is the biggest polluter in the world, but it never had the same restrictions as the US under the Paris Agreement. China signed the deal and promised to peak its emissions by 2030, meaning it will keep increasing pollution for several more years before cutting back. While China is investing a lot in solar and wind energy, it is also building more coal plants, which makes things worse. By leaving the Paris Agreement, Trump made it clear that America would focus on oil and gas instead of clean energy. His administration has pushed for more drilling to increase oil production. This means more jobs in the oil industry, but it also means more pollution. On the same day, Trump also signed another executive order, removing the US from the World Health Organization, WHO. He accused the WHO of being biased and failing to handle global health problems properly. This decision meant that, in the middle of major health crises, America would no longer be part of the world's biggest health organization. A few weeks later, on February 3, 2025, Trump cut US funding to important United Nations organizations. These included the UN Human Rights Council, UNHRC, and the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA. The US had always been one of the biggest contributors to these agencies, so the decision weakened them significantly. Trump claimed these groups were anti-Israel and not working effectively. With these actions, Trump showed he was not bluffing. He made it clear that America would no longer lead the world in solving global problems unless there was a direct benefit to the US. Many world leaders were shocked because the US had always played a big role in organizations like the UN and WHO. Now, other countries like China and Russia are stepping in to fill the gap, increasing their influence while America steps back. While all these withdrawals are devastating to US foreign influence, the real damage may still be yet to come. Trump is talking about withdrawing from the IMF and the World Bank. Now, this is where the true damage will be done. Let's take a look at this. The US has historically been the largest financial contributor to both the IMF and the World Bank, granting it unparalleled sway over global economic policies. With approximately 17% of the voting power in the IMF, the US possesses veto authority over major decisions, as significant actions require an 85% majority. This dominance has allowed the US to steer global economic strategies, ensuring that its interests are safeguarded on the international stage. The strategic role of the IMF and World Bank in shaping US economic dominance cannot be overstated. These institutions act as instruments of US foreign policy, providing financial assistance to countries in distress, often with conditions that align with American geopolitical interests. For instance, the US has utilized the IMF to support allies and promote economic policies favorable to its own economy. This symbiotic relationship has fortified the US's position as a global leader, both economically and politically. Now consider the results if the US were to sever ties with these institutions. Such a withdrawal would not only diminish America's ability to influence global economic policies, but also embolden rival nations to fill the void. Countries like China and Russia, already advocating for a multipolar world order, would seize the opportunity to expand their influence, potentially restructuring these institutions to serve their own interests. This shift could marginalize the US, relegating it to a spectator in arenas where it once played a starring role. Furthermore, the US dollar's supremacy as the world's reserve currency could be jeopardized. The dollar's dominance has been underpinned by the US's leadership in global financial institutions. A retreat from the IMF and World Bank could accelerate the ongoing de-dollarization trend, where countries diversify their reserves away from the dollar. Recent data indicates that the dollar's share of global reserves has declined to 59.2%, down from approximately 70% in 2000. This erosion could lead to reduced demand for the dollar, impacting its value and the U.S.'s ability to borrow cheaply. The potential damage extends beyond economics. The U.S.'s geopolitical leverage, often exercised through financial diplomacy, would wane. The ability to impose economic sanctions, influence policy reforms in debtor nations, and lead global development initiatives would be severely curtailed. This vacuum could be filled by nations whose interests may not align with those of the U.S., leading to a realignment of global power structures. Trump is also considering leaving NATO. Now, this is the decision that would totally end the U.S. reign as the world's most powerful nation. But how serious is he? Recent reports indicate that President Donald Trump has threatened to weaken or abandon NATO, prompting European nations to consider plans to assume greater responsibility for their defense over the next 5 to 10 years. NATO's financial framework is a blend of direct and indirect contributions. Direct funding, known as the Common Fund, supports NATO's operational budget, which was $3.6 billion in 2023. Each member contributes based on its economic size, with the U.S. covering approximately 16% of this budget, amounting to around $572 million. Indirect funding involves each country committing to spend 2% of its GDP on national defense, a guideline established at the 2014 NATO summit. In 2023, the U.S. allocated 3.49% of its GDP to defense, totaling $860 billion, which represented 68% of NATO's total defense expenditure. The strategic advantages of NATO for the U.S. are great. The alliance ensures a stable Europe, preventing conflicts that could escalate into global wars. This stability fosters robust economic ties. In 2015, the U.S. engaged in $699 billion in bilateral trade with the European Union. Such trade is underpinned by the security that NATO provides, safeguarding key ports and airfields essential for commerce. Beyond economics, NATO serves as a force multiplier for U.S. military operations. The alliance's collective defense mechanism means that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all, thereby deterring potential adversaries. This collective security arrangement amplifies U.S. military capabilities and extends its global reach without bearing the full burden unilaterally. The U.S. defense industry significantly benefits from NATO's structure. European nations, reliant on advanced military technology, often turn to American defense contractors. Notably, at least 7 European countries have planned to purchase the U.S. F-35 fifth-generation aircraft, with potential orders reaching up to 500 units. These acquisitions not only enhance interoperability among NATO forces, but also bolster the U.S. economy through substantial defense contracts. NATO's standardization protocols create a captive market for U.S. defense companies. Member countries aim to maintain compatibility with U.S. military systems, leading them to procure American-made weapons and equipment. This dynamic ensures sustained demand for U.S. defense products, reinforcing the country's dominance in global arms sales. However, discussions about the U.S. potentially withdrawing from NATO have raised alarms. Such a move could destabilize the current security architecture, emboldening adversarial nations and undermining decades of strategic alliances. The financial implications are also concerning. A hypothetical 50% reduction in U.S. overseas security commitments could result in a $490 billion annual decrease in GDP, even after accounting for potential savings. In response to these growing uncertainties, European nations are proactively enhancing their defense capabilities. Germany, for instance, has approved a €500 billion fund aimed at economic growth and military spending, a clear signal that Europe is preparing to take more responsibility for its own security. Over the next 5 to 10 years, the continent's leading powers are developing plans to reduce reliance on the United States and build a more self-sufficient defense strategy. Meanwhile, China is moving quickly to strengthen global alliances, positioning itself as the new center of international diplomacy. As America steps back, Beijing is stepping forward, and the global balance of power is starting to shift. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and stay tuned for our next upload as we continue tracking the biggest changes shaping the world.